Hello, and welcome to the Ideology podcast. I'm your host, Jesse.
And I'm your host, Brendan.
Today we're talking to Franklin. Now, how would you describe yourself politically?
My preferred term is Stalinist, and there's a bit of inter-community, I guess, debate about the merits of that term, but that's the term I prefer.
Okay, so how has that affected your personal life in any way? Do you have any stories about, telling someone you're a Stalinist?
Yeah, actually, I'm a student. I'm actually a college senior, and I was doing an internship for a state government. Um, and I was talking to my boss at the time, who was a great guy. I knew him before the internship, and that's how I actually got in, was through this connection with him.
Hmm.
But we decided to sit down and have a conversation. I explained some of my views, and he's bald, by the way. The man is, and so we started getting more and more heated, I guess.
Yeah.
And we ended up just bursting out laughing at each other. One, because we realized we would never reach a middle ground, but two, he was so mad and we were so heated that like the red in his face had gone like all the way around his head to the back of his neck, and we just busted up laughing.
Yeah.
But generally produces a lot of head meet wall situations.
Yeah. Where people just kind of repeat the same, but didn't this happen? Like that stuff?
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a lot of like in certain communities, especially I feel like especially communist ones, but that's only because that's the community I know.
Mhm.
You hit the same arguments 10 times, and so you have kind of like a file in your mind that's like, all right, when they talk about this for the 15th time, this is the argument I'll use.
Yeah. Mhm.
The master post, if you will, the master file of stupid arguments that I've had to explain 15 times.
So, how did you kind of get these beliefs? Because typically, there's a lot of capitalism in America. So, how did you kind of come to agree with the Stalinistic beliefs?
Yeah.
It's kind of funny. I actually I had an adult, I call him a mentor, I suppose, who would we would have these really long, interesting, engaging talks, and we would talk about anything under the sun. And at one point, he explained, or he tried to explain communism. Frankly, he did a piss poor job of it,
Hmm.
but he explained it to me, and I was like, okay, this seems really interesting. And he was like, well, what? But unfortunately, all of these things happen. And I was like, but what if they don't? And so I just started my own research from there. And I realized that a lot of the things he was talking about were historical fallacies, were things that were just typical conservative talking points. The man turned out to be a pretty hardcore libertarian.
Hmm.
But he put me on that path as kind of, he thought he was being a deterrent, and he actually set me down looking at some of these paths, and understanding, or I believe understanding, some of the flaws in capitalism and some of the ways that I believe that we can counter these flaws. But no, it absolutely, I mean, you're absolutely right. If you were to pull 100 people off the street, I would say that 100 of them would tell you that they were pro-capitalism, and that's obviously that's something that uh, you realize growing up, in the U.S. like I did, and like I'm sure it sounds like you guys did as well. But
Yeah. So, I have a question. We just got done talking with someone who described themselves as a Marxist-Leninist, and I'd like to know what the differentiation is between that and a Stalinist is.
so that's kind of the inter-community debate right now, the merits of the term Stalinism. So a Marxist-Leninist is someone who uh, uses or agrees or signs on to the theory of traditional Marxist thought, and then the additions made by Vladimir Lenin up to, during, and after the revolution of 1917.
Hmm.
And so that's things like the final stage of capitalism is imperialism, and these concepts of the dictatorship of the proletariat and things like that. And so what an admittedly small number of us believe is that Stalinism is a further branch off of Marxism Leninism, in that it has it takes this base core that is Marxism Leninism, or ML as we call it, and there's another layer which is usually described or delineated as things like the use of the state to coerce and create a state of terror for capitalists and reactionary forces. This idea of a bureaucratic arm within the state, parallel to democratic workers' councils, the concept of socialism in one country, and this or not anti, but sort of more understanding of historical conditions concerning the globalism, and Trotsky has this idea of like the revolution has to take place instantaneously the whole world across. And Stalin was like, no, that's stupid. Just because if you make gains in one region doesn't mean that you should shut that revolution down, because gains are not made the world over. It's things like that that are, I believe, a build on Marxism-Leninism, and that's what differentiates for me between the two.
That's interesting. So we read a bit about Stalinism, and we got to the point of the socialism in one country aspect of it, and could you elaborate about what that is? Because we're a little bit confused.
Yeah, so in traditional Marxist theory and Trotskyist theory, and a couple other of these, like, kind of the problem of communism is like everybody has their own thing and there's so many denominations, but a lot of people think of communism in a global sense, and that like it has to take place the world over immediately, and that's the only way to make sustainable advances against capitalism and the bourgeoisie class and so on. Stalin, and to a small extent Lenin talked about it, but Stalin was the actor, I should say, had this idea of socialism in one country, which is that the mode of production, the styles of socialism, which is worker controls of the means of production, the dictatorship of the proletariat, things like that, can be conducted within the nation or within the borders of a nation, and can still interact with the outside world in a limited way without poisoning the socialism within. So it's this idea that you can be a socialist country in a world that is capitalist, with certain caveats, with protections against what we call reactionary forces, which are things, people, institutions, outside forces that try to change socialist countries back to capitalism, or sometimes military coups, basically anything other than socialism. Did that explain? Was that clear?
That does a very good job of explaining it. Yeah. There was also the whole cult of personality around Stalin that is pretty controversial, because you see a bunch of and I was wondering if that was you see a bunch of famously bad dictators using it, like Hitler, the Korean regime, the North Korean regime, and I was wondering if that is like a core tenet of Stalinism, or if that is just a result of the man himself, just of Stalin.
I think that, so that's kind of a complicated question. I would say first and foremost, no, a cult of personality is not a requirement or a tenet of Stalinism. However, a cult of personality, or the ability to recognize leaders, founders, revolutionaries, is a useful tool insofar as it's taken to a certain level. It can't be taken too far. So in anarchist thought, there's this, I'm going to totally forget the name now, of course, but it's basically, I think it's called worship of the deed or something like that. And it's like you support people for their actions. So nobody gets famous. You don't know someone's name because of them, but because of what they do. And so that's the kind of relationship between a proletariat and the revolution or the founder or the leader or whatever that is acceptable. But I would say that, again, no, this tenant of or this idea of the cult of personality is not a tenant. And I can agree that it can be downright harmful, because you tie yourself so closely to someone or something, and then you find yourself either abandoning that concept when there's something wrong with it, or constantly you find yourself in a pit trying to to defend that person or that thing. It's kind of like like the people who liked with recently in the news, with Louis C.K., the people who really like him, and I frankly, I don't care either way. I never thought he was that funny, but whatever. The people who liked him came out and they were like, yes, we liked, either you came out and you were like, yeah, what he did was bad, screw him, or you had to double down because you had talked about him, or you had built your identity or personality around liking this actor, Louis C.K.
Yeah.
And when things change, you got to be like, no, I got to double down. I'm going to defend him. And because he's a part of my identity, I suppose, So there is that issue. I don't know how I managed to work Louis C.K. into this, but I'm proud of me
it's
for
good.
that.
It's relevant, current events. That's what we need.
In 200 years, somebody will listen to this and be like, who the fuck was Louis C.K.? What are they talking about?
In 200 years, when people will listen to this obscure podcast.
Yeah.
If only.
This will be the last thing they find on Earth, in the ruins of our civilization.
Yeah. So, what it sounds to me, through a very, pretty honestly, unread, uneducated on the subject, through a lens of that nature, it sounds like you are a communist, but also a realist in the way of its implementation. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Communism is absolutely a blanket term. There's 32 flavors of communist, as it were. But yeah, Stalinism really focuses on concrete solutions and actions that would be taken, because it's so tightly based in the historical conditions of Russia in 1918. And so some people think like, oh, that's a bad thing. You can't respond to the outside world. But the things the policies and the concrete solutions that were proposed are 100% applicable to, I would say, if not all, most countries. And that is things like the nationalization of industry, collectivization of agriculture, and things like that. I mean, yes, industrialization was a policy of the USSR, but it's not a tenet of Stalinism, because we live in an industrialized world for the most part. Like, I had people talk to me and they're like, oh, if you took over the world tomorrow, what's the first thing you would do? Would you start building factories and blah, blah? And I was like, why? Why in the hell would I build factories when we have thousands of them rotting across the Midwest? Like,
yeah,
that's a solution that's no longer necessary,
Yeah. There's you mentioned the collectivization of agriculture, and I might sound like one of those people who hits their head against the wall, but I've read about just from a tiny bit of sources about the famine, especially in the Ukraine.
The Ukrainian famine, yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds like the collectivization, at a very extremely cursory just glance over, it sounds like that was a net harm to the region, honestly.
There's no way for me to word this that doesn't make me sound like a jackass, but it's because of your cursory glance at this information that you come away with that topic. So,
of course.
Oh man, we're already like 25 minutes in. I thought I still had like 10 minutes, or I can't really,
Oh, On our end, we have 16 minutes. We're 16 minutes in.
Oh, okay. I just looked at the clock and I figured, okay, if we start at 4:30, but okay,
You're
perfect.
good. Go on ahead.
Time to do this whole thing. So, um, there's a number of issues with the scholarly material on the Ukrainian famine that I think a lot of people that, again, like you said, this is one of those arguments that we, beat our head into the wall.
Mm-hmm.
But so to kind of do a step by step here, basically the situation for the listeners who don't know, in 1932 and 1933 there was a severe famine in the Ukraine, which at the time was called the basket of the Soviet Union, the bread basket, because it had huge grain growing capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1920, I want to say 28, when
right.
Stalin began collectivizing, there was in 32 there was this horrible famine, and so there was this natural tie, like, see communist ideas like collectivization of agriculture cause famine. But that's an extremely prima facie and blasé view of the thing. So to go into more depth, the first thing is in Ukraine. I wish I had a translation, but it's in Russian. They're called kulaks, and they're wealthy landowners. They're people who owned agricultural centers before the collectivization. And in 31, 32, 33, as these people were being phased out, there's a history of these wealthy landowners burning their crops in the fields, destroying their silos, slaughtering animals into the dust, rather than have their supplies be collectivized. Mm-hmm. So to start, we have people, just brutalizing and destroying any agricultural product rather than allow it to be collectivized and used by the Soviet government. Secondly, collectivization brought huge technological change to the Ukraine. This was still a primarily feudal backwater society. People were using like steel plows and hoes and things like that. And so suddenly the Soviet Union is like, hey, rather than use 50 people in a plow, this is a tractor. Here's how to And so tractors were sent down there, but no one was sent to teach the peasants who were living in the Ukraine how to use the tractors. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of of disastrous and poor use of the machinery that caused damage. There are documentation of peasants, rather than collectivize, would sabotage the machinery that was sent down there. So we have that. And then on top of that, in 1928, the United States, having recognized the Soviet Union, enacted something called the Soviet gold embargo. And basically what it was, as a way for the Soviets to rebuild their economy, they were exporting their own gold currency, their own gold-pegged currency, in the form of coinage. And the U.S. Basically told Western Europe and the developed world, do not take this gold currency. We're not using it. And if you do take it from them, you're not going to get $1 from us. Through that policy, the Soviet Union was only allowed to trade in agricultural goods like wheat and barley, timber, fur, and oil. So they're having to, anytime they want to interact on the international market, they have to use these agricultural products. There's only so much fur to go around. In winter, it's really hard to get timber and things like that. It's far more dangerous in winter than it is in summer. And they were not industrialized to the point of being able to mass produce oil, at least not at the scale they needed. Yeah. So the U.S. sort of forced them to sell agricultural products to industrialize. So now we get to 1932. Previous agricultural yields have been destroyed rather than collectivized. Peasants are revolting rather than, or when they are trying to use the technology, they're misusing it and destroying it. The Soviet Union is forced to trade on the international market for anything it needs via agricultural goods. And then this famine hits. And the year before, 1931, there were 10 regions of agricultural production in the Ukraine. I believe 6 of them went under drought in 1931.
Mm-hmm.
So they historically low crop yield. So as part of this, the Soviet Union just slashes their exports. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think they cut something like several hundred million bushels of wheat in exports. They cut it from 1931 to 1932 to respond to this famine.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they respond to this this famine. People absolutely did die. I mean, nobody argues that. People die every day, and things like famine were extremely common, especially in Tsarist Russia.
Yeah.
This kind of feudal backwater society. People had no concept of agricultural security, and so these kinds of famines were incredibly common. But the last point is there is two, I guess, arguments associated with. One is that this famine was the direct implementation. It was a plan. Stalin got his rocks off killing Ukrainians.
Yeah, it was like
and that's
Holocaust type thing.
Exactly. And so for me, I mean, that's kind of stupid for two reasons. One, you saw that, or rather, you can see the slash of grain export. So rather than continue to trade on the international market, they're going to slash their exports to provide more grain or more cereals to affected regions. And then two, in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, there was all these like documents released. There was the treasure trove of documents from the Kremlin, and they never found, and they have no reason to believe, there was a direct policy document that says, hey, starve Ukrainians. Like this was not implemented. It was just a bureaucratic failure.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second argument that I have is, I'm sure you guys have heard of it. If you even type in COMM on Google, the Black Book of Communism pops up.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it's a piece of trash document. It was a book that was written I want to say in like the 70s or 80s or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And these three scholars tried to map out how many people were killed under various communist regimes. And the two of the authors were like, yeah, we totally lied. And one of them was like, yeah, not only did we lie, like we all sat down and said, okay, what number should we think of that's adequately scary? And that's how they got the 100 million figure. So this scholarly article, air quotes, is totally garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but we still use that as the basis for the understanding this famine. I think it's as high as 8 million people that supposedly died comes from this Black Book of Communism. And even though we're like, okay, yeah, the scholarly book is terrible, we're still going to use the numbers provided by it. And it's just silly when you look at census data from the Soviet Union, because if we take the Ukrainian population, and I'm going to scale the numbers down just to make simple math, if we say the Ukrainian population was 20 million and 6 million people die off,
mm-hmm.
between 1931 and 1932, there was an increase in population of 2.5 million. So apparently, when 6 million people died off, the remaining 14 million not only reproduced enough to have 6 million children, but an additional 2.5 on top of that, presuming 0 infant mortality rate, 0 death in labor, 0 old people died. Mm-hmm. These numbers are just stupid, and it's kind of, I'm getting a little heated, but it's just silly when you look at but it's just silly when you look at the evidence and a lot of the census data, and it becomes obvious that this narrative that we tell is not a product of fact, but a product of the United States was scared of the Soviet Union. The United States has always used communism as a boogeyman since the Russian Revolution,
mm-hmm.
and we continue to do so. I mean, the idea of the Holodomor is, I'm sure I pronounce it wrong, but the idea actually came from and was originally produced by the Nazi war ministry. Really? Goebbels himself wrote this, the article or the the analysis of it, and it was repeated in the US by the Nazi allies, the Hearst Press. So this idea that we're using old Nazi propaganda, but it's okay because it fights communism is part of the reason that I'm like, I have so little faith in unfortunately that sector of academia. And there are better books on the topic. I'm trying to think of his name now. Historian Grover Furr, Michael Parenti, I think his name is Robert Tuttle, all do a fairer analysis of the famine in Ukraine in a way that is not outright propaganda. And I think that with an open mind, with an adequate look at the evidence, which unfortunately, I mean, it's a lot of like looking through government documents and stuff that makes you want to blow your brains out. But the narrative is unequivocally false. The concept of it is just silly on its face, but we repeat it because communism is the bad guy. Whew, okay, that was like 20 straight minutes of me.
That was good, though. That was a very good history lesson. You went in depth.
And that, I mean, I did not, obviously, I didn't know that like flat off. I've watched like 15 videos and I've given this argument so many times that it's like, all right, check,
Get this in, yeah. That was good. That was interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have anything?
Okay, so I feel that like most humans in nature are materialistic and competitive with each other, which I feel like capitalism kind of caters to those those needs. And then with communism, you have more of a kind of an equality standpoint where everybody's on the same level. Do you feel that becomes an issue? Do you feel people are as productive as they would be without that competition necessarily, without the material things that people want?
Well, so there's a lot to unpack there. One, I absolutely agree with you that capitalism sort of panders to this competitive, I got mine, fuck you attitude. That's absolutely correct. Second of all, you mentioned like materialism and we want things to ourselves. And I want to take that point just a quick second to do a quick segue into Marx's definition of property, because that's a really common misconception, is that like there's a meme, that communists want to like everybody gets one toothbrush and we all share it as the state,
Yeah.
But there's a distinction between what's called private property and personal property. Personal property is your home, your car, your toothbrush, your bed, blankets, whatever. It's the things that you yourself own and that you are entitled to.
Yeah.
Like, we do not want your toothbrush. Nobody's collectivizing homes or whatever. And then there's private property, and private property is defined as the means of production. That's things like land with natural resources, factories, offices, plants of any kind. So there is that distinction between property that I just wanted to point out real quick. And then to go back now to your original thing. Again, there's two points in that statement. One of which is, are people still productive under a socialist mode of production? And then, is there any kind of problem with being of ignoring that competitive aspect of human life? Is that correct? Am I restating your argument correctly? Just because I want to respond, to the right points, obviously.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So for this idea of like, are people productive under a socialist mode of production? I think that's extremely clear that they are. I mean, if you take the USSR to be a socialist mode of production, which I believe it was, I mean, the workers owned the means of production. There were democratic workers' councils to decide things. There was a central planning committee, but this planning committee was still parallel to democratic representation of the workers. But so if we take the USSR to be an example of a socialist mode of production, I mean, They massively industrialized in 25 years. They became the second largest economy in 50 years, the second largest military force on the planet. Frankly, the planet has ever seen. In 1971, the World Health Organization declared that the Soviet Union's free healthcare was the best healthcare system on the planet.
Really?
I mean, there's just item upon item that shows that the socialist mode of production does not diminish our ability to produce in any way, shape, or form. We just don't produce. They're called commodities, and it's the silly things that people don't need. So, like, yes, the Soviet Union was not known for its sports cars because people don't need luxury sports cars. That's not a thing, you know. But they managed to avoid famine every year after 1932 because food is a necessity. You know, they produce things, clothing, boots. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I don't know. I don't know why my phone suddenly. Oh, you know what? When I turned it on, I can't turn off the sound system for like notifications and things either.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah. I mean, there's obvious evidence that people are at least equally productive under a socialist mode of production. But then to this idea of a competitive nature, I think that's actually antithetical. If you look at a lot of some of the more basic anthropological studies and things like that, humans being social animals naturally work in competition. Oh my God. Sorry.
You're all right.
Okay. That ought to fix that. Okay. So humans naturally work in competition. We understand from a very young age that the death of the single unit is not the death of the collective. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that like people are expendable, but we still realize that like we are part of something bigger. And so communists generally believe in this idea of that social, I'm trying to think of how to put it, social interaction and feelings and things like that. This idea of a competitive nature is controlled by or created by environment. So we grow up under a capitalist system. We think in terms of a market economy. We think in terms of competition. You know, I want to get the best price for my goods. You want to pay the least amount for my goods, whatever. So then, yes, we're obviously going to think and act and live in a competitive nature. But if the historical conditions change such that we are living in a time where we do not have to constantly try, like we are not at every turn trying to rob the other person blind, then that competitive nature is no longer an issue. And that's to say competitive in the market. I mean, there's nothing wrong like with competitive in sports or what have you, but this idea of like, I have to screw the other guy over in every economic transaction because it's the only way for me to get ahead is only applicable in a capitalist society. And that's my big differentiation between Marxism and anarchism, which I mean, we can circle back around to if we have the time for it. But yeah, so I think I answered your points there with everything.
Yeah, no, you made a lot of excellent points. Because in fact, I was going to talk about that. I do agree that I think it growing up in a capitalistic society does influence that heavily, because if you were to take like a brand new kind of generation of people and not necessarily teach them that, hey, if you grow up and you work really hard, you can own a business and you can become really rich and you can have nice like sports cars and a big house. If you were to take that away and teach them that it's better to work towards necessities rather than I want to grow up and I want to work super hard so I can own an expensive car. Yeah. I feel like it'd be far more, communism would be far more successful. Whereas I don't necessarily think that, I think the U.S. would have a hard time converting over to those kind of beliefs because everyone here grows up with those thoughts already that, hey, I can have all these nice, necessarily like material things, and that it would be difficult for people to kind of leave that aside and be like, I don't necessarily want that. I would rather, work towards this necessity. Yeah.
I had this conversation just a day ago with somebody, and they were talking about, the same basic point that like people cannot change overnight. And you're absolutely right. That's why, again, this is my big bone to pick with anarchism. But the reason that I'm a Stalinist, that I believe in Marxism-Leninism, is that it purports the use of the state, the entity of the state, to conduct political, social, and economic reforms to teach people this new way. Like if we just got rid of capitalism tomorrow and the state just disappeared, I am 100% certain that everyone would go out and continue to live under the capitalist mode of production because we don't know anything else. It's so many people only understand this idea of a rat race and like I have to screw over my neighbor to get ahead. But you can absolutely re-educate. People can learn that not everything has to be a competition, and that we can actually achieve much greater things by working together. You work really hard, you own your business, and this is a communist interpretation. You own your business, you exploit your workers for extra profit, and you get a fancy car and so on. But if you don't think in that term, if instead, you have the means of production, you and your fellow people, you and your fellow workers council work, and you create a bunch of these goods, like let's say you're producing cars or something, like, yeah, you can sit at the top of the pyramid and you can have a really fancy car and exploit your workers to produce however many cars per year, or you can work in this sort of communist mode or mode of production where like everybody's working together to create as many cars, to build as many of the product as possible. And like, yeah, you don't get your fancy ass car, but like grandma down the street doesn't have to walk, the 10 miles to work every day. Like there is a focus on the collective needs over the needs of the individual, and this idea of like, what is a commodity versus a necessity. But
well, we're closing in on our end time, and we'd like to know if there's anything else, any parting words you'd like to say, a call to action.
I would just say challenge everything. Well, okay, not everything. Like, do not jump off buildings you cannot fly. But there is, understand the inherent wants of any institution, any one thing, and its ability to go after what it wants. So capitalism has an inherent interest in extending the life of capitalism and devaluing alternative systems. Once you understand that everybody has a goal, has an end concept or want, you can better look at the facts and I think better come to a conclusion about what is the better system, what produces what, within the context of like, okay, capitalism obviously is going to talk shit about, is going to devaluing communism because that's what capitalism does, So just be aware of the powers that be aware of things around you, in that not everything that you learn immediately or not everything at face value is what it is or is correct. That was super bland. I'm sure somebody will take that 15 different ways from what I meant, but
yeah, that was good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? I realize this is like a one-time podcast or anything, but I actually really enjoyed this. If y'all wanted to do something again, more specific or whatever, I'm always available. So yeah, I think that's all I have.
Thank you. We'll definitely keep you in contact. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All
right. Bye.
So that was Franklin. He was a Stalinist, and I thought he had some interesting and very well articulated discussion to give us. Yeah, and I also just realized that we are matching. That is,
yep.
that's unintentional. I feel a little bit goofy now, but anyway.
But regardless, we would just like to thank Franklin again for being such a great guest on the podcast. And we would like to thank you guys for watching and or listening.
Yeah. Have a great day.